every crime is a wound on the world. We're here to dissect it, layer by layer, to find the truth buried within. This is Anatomy of Crime. It begins, as so many American stories do, on a freeway. But this is not a story of speed. It is a story of slowness, of a deliberate, agonizing crawl watched by 95 million people. The subject of their gaze is a single white Ford Bronco, stark against the asphalt ribbons of Southern California. It's the evening of June 17, 1994. Inside that vehicle is a man who, until a few days ago, was an American icon. Orenthal James Simpson, O.J. the Juice, a hero of the gridiron, a charming face on television, a man who seemed to have transcended race and class to become pure celebrity, an untouchable figure floating above the messy realities of American life. But now he is a fugitive. In the passenger seat, his loyal friend and former teammate Al Cowlings is on the phone with the police, his voice strained with panic, reporting that Simpson is in the back, holding a gun to his own head, listening to the pleas of detectives on the radio. Below, on the overpasses, a strange and unsettling carnival is forming. People gather with signs, not of condemnation, but of support. "Go, OJ, go, we love the Juice." They cheer as if he's just broken another tackle, running for daylight. It's a bizarre, surreal pilgrimage, broadcast live from a swarm of news helicopters that have abandoned all other stories. This is the only story. News channels interrupt the NBA Finals, a championship game, to show this slow-motion tragedy unfolding. It is a moment of profound national rupture, a public nervous breakdown played out on live television, the ultimate collision of sports, celebrity, and crime. The pursuit ended peacefully hours later, at his Brentwood mansion on Rockingham Avenue. But the spectacle had only just begun. The murders of his ex-wife, Nicole Brown Simpson, and a young waiter named Ronald Goldman were brutal, intimate, and horrifying. The evidence pointing towards Simpson seemed overwhelming, a veritable mountain of forensic data that prosecutors believed made it an open and shut case. But what followed was not a straightforward murder trial. It was an 11-month epic that hijacked the nation's attention, a daily drama that exposed the deepest fissures in American society. Along lines of race, class, and fame, it turned lawyers into superstars, witnesses into household names, and the courtroom into a television studio. The question of, did he do it, was eclipsed by a larger, more complex set of questions about justice, celebrity, and the stories we choose to believe. Today, we are not here to retry the case. We are here to dissect its unique and enduring power. Today, we explore the anatomy of a modern media trial. The story of the crime itself begins in darkness, on the quiet, manicured streets of Brentwood, a neighborhood where the rustle of leaves and the hum of sprinkler systems are the loudest sounds. On the night of Sunday, June 12, 1994, that peace was shattered. The final hours for Nicole Brown Simpson and Ronald Goldman were, by all accounts, unremarkable. Nicole had dinner with her family, including her children, Sydney and Justin, at a local Italian restaurant, Mezzaluna, a place she frequented. It was a family meal, a celebration after her daughter's dance recital. Afterwards, her mother, Juditha Brown, realized she had left her prescription glasses behind. A young waiter at the restaurant, 25-year-old Ron Goldman, a kind and aspiring model and actor, found the glasses and offered to drop them off at Nicole's home after his shift. It was a simple act of courtesy, a gesture he had likely performed countless times. Sometime after 11 p.m., a neighbor of Nicole's, walking his dog, noticed her Akita, Kato, barking relentlessly, a plaintive wail as he would later describe it. The dog had blood on its paws and seemed deeply agitated, leading the neighbor on a strange journey that eventually brought him to Nicole's condominium at 875 South Bundy Drive. It was there, just past midnight, that the first glimpse of the horror was seen. Sprawled at the bottom of the front steps in a pool of blood so massive it had stained the terracotta tiles a deep, sickening black, was the body of Nicole Brown Simpson. She was 35 years old. She was dressed in a simple black dress, lying in a fetal position. She had been stabbed multiple times in the head and neck with such ferocity that her head was almost completely severed from her body. A few feet away, slumped against a wrought iron fence near some shrubbery, was the body of Ron Goldman. He had put up a desperate, valiant fight. His body was covered in defensive wounds. His knuckles were bruised, a testament to his struggle against a frenzied and overpowering attacker. He had been stabbed over 24 times. The scene was one of utter carnage, an explosion of rage that left 2 people dead in a matter of minutes. To understand the trial that followed, we must first understand the people whose lives were so violently ended. Nicole Brown was more than just a famous man's ex-wife. She was a daughter, a sister, and a devoted mother to her 2 young children, who were asleep inside the condominium while their mother was being murdered just outside. Born in West Germany, she moved to Southern California as a child, growing into a vibrant, beautiful young woman. She was, by all accounts, the center of her family, the glue that held them together. She met O.J. Simpson in 1977 when she was just 18 and working as a waitress at a Beverly Hills nightclub. He was 30, a superstar at the height of his fame, and still married to his first wife. Their connection was immediate and intense, and they married in 1985. To the public, they were a golden couple, the embodiment of the American dream. But behind the closed doors of their Rockingham estate, a different story was unfolding. It was a story of control, jealousy, and terrifying violence. Friends and family would later recount a pattern of escalating abuse. Her friend Faye Resnick would write a book detailing a life of constant fear. O.J. monitored Nicole's movements, dictated what she could wear, and flew into rages over perceived slights. There were public humiliations and private beatings. The most infamous incident occurred on New Year's Day, 1989. Police responded to a 911 call from a terrified Nicole to find her beaten, bruised, and hiding in the bushes outside her home, screaming, "He's going to kill me! He's going to kill me!" O.J. Simpson was arrested, but the consequences were minimal. He pleaded no contest to spousal abuse, paid a small fine, was ordered to perform community service, and was allowed to receive counseling over the phone. The NFL, his corporate sponsors, and much of the public seemed to look the other way. The incident was treated as a private matter, a lover's quarrel. Nicole began documenting the abuse. In a safe deposit box, she kept a collection of photographs of her bruised face, diary entries detailing the violence, and a will. It was a chronicle of fear, an insurance policy she hoped would protect her. They divorced in 1992, but O.J.'s obsession reportedly continued. He stalked her, watched her through her windows, and grew enraged when she began dating other men. Just weeks before the murders, she had ended their final attempt at reconciliation, telling friends she was finally free but also afraid. The prosecution would argue that the murders were not a random act of violence, but the final, horrific act in a long and documented history of domestic abuse, the ultimate act of control from a man who could not stand to lose her. Ron Goldman was the tragic bystander, the young man who was simply in the wrong place at the very worst time. He was handsome, athletic, and well-liked, working as a waiter while trying to make a life for himself in Los Angeles, with dreams of opening his own restaurant. He was a good son and a loyal friend, known for his warm smile and easygoing nature. His only connection to the scene was his burgeoning friendship with Nicole. His death was a testament to the sheer indiscriminate rage of the killer. He fought for his life, and in doing so, he left behind crucial evidence on his body and at the scene, evidence that would become central to the prosecution's case. He was not just a secondary victim. He was a hero who tried to intervene, and his family's quiet dignity and relentless pursuit of justice would become a powerful moral anchor in the chaotic trial that followed. His father, Fred Goldman, would become a fixture in the courtroom, his raw, visible grief a constant reminder of the human cost of the crime. The man at the center of it all was a figure of mythological proportions in American culture. O.J. Simpson was not just a football player. He was one of the greatest running backs of all time. The Juice was a Heisman Trophy winner, an NFL MVP, the first player to rush for 2,000 yards in a season. His grace and power on the field were mesmerizing. But his true genius may have been in his post-football career. He transitioned seamlessly into a beloved public figure. He was a sports commentator, a movie star in films like The Naked Gun, and most famously, the friendly face of Hertz rental cars, running through airports with a smile. He was charming, handsome, and universally liked. Crucially, he had achieved a kind of post-racial status in the eyes of mainstream white America. He wasn't a black celebrity. He was just O.J. He himself famously said, "I'm not black, I'm O.J." This carefully cultivated image was his brand, and it made him millions. When police arrived at his Rockingham estate in the early hours of June 13th to inform him of his ex-wife's death, his carefully constructed persona began to fracture. Detectives Mark Furman and Philip Van Atter noted his strange lack of surprise and a fresh cut on the middle finger of his left hand. They also saw what appeared to be blood drops on the driveway of his estate. On the property, they would soon find one of the most critical pieces of evidence in the entire case, a single bloody right-handed leather glove, a match to one found at the Bundy crime scene. Simpson gave a rambling, inconsistent statement to police, and then, as the evidence mounted, he did the unthinkable. He became a fugitive. On June 17th, the day he was supposed to surrender to police, his lawyer Robert Shapiro held a press conference to announce that Simpson had disappeared. A short time later, his longtime friend Robert Kardashian stood before the cameras and read a rambling, bizarre letter from O.J. that sounded very much like a suicide note. And then, the California Highway Patrol spotted him in the white Bronco, and the whole world started to watch. The initial investigation, led by the Los Angeles Police Department, was swift and, on the surface, incredibly effective. They were dealing with a high-profile suspect and a crime of shocking brutality, and they quickly amassed what seemed to be an insurmountable case. Prosecutor Marcia Clark would later call it a mountain of evidence, and it's easy to see why. The evidence created a narrative, a trail of breadcrumbs that seemed to lead directly from the murder scene on Bundy Drive to O.J. Simpson's bedroom on Rockingham Avenue. Let's dissect this supposed mountain. It began with the blood. Blood, a silent witness, was everywhere. There was a trail of at least 5 blood drops at the Bundy crime scene, leading away from the bodies along the walkway. DNA testing, specifically a method called RFLP, or restriction fragment length polymorphism, was still relatively new to the public but scientifically powerful. It showed that these blood drops did not belong to Nicole or Ron, but they did match O.J. Simpson's DNA profile. the odds of it belonging to someone else were astronomical. Blood consistent with Nicole's and Ron's was also found inside Simpson's Ford Bronco, on the driver's side door, the steering wheel, the center console, and on the carpeting. This placed the victims, or at least their blood, inside the vehicle he drove that night. Then there were the infamous gloves. At the Bundy crime scene, near Ron Goldman's body, investigators found a left-handed Aris isotoner leather glove, size extra large, soaked in blood. Back at Simpson's Rockingham estate, on a narrow, dark path behind the guest house where his house guest, Cato Kellen, was staying, Detective Mark Furman discovered the matching right-handed glove. It too was covered in blood, and that blood contained a gruesome mixture, the DNA of both Nicole Brown Simpson and Ron Goldman, but also the DNA of O.J. Simpson himself. It was a perfect forensic link, tying the suspect to both victims at the scene of the crime. Furthermore, fibers on the glove matched fibers from Ron Goldman's shirt, and hairs found on Goldman's shirt were consistent with Simpson's. It was a treasure trove of trace evidence. The evidence continued inside the Rockingham mansion. In the master bedroom, a pair of black socks was found on the floor near the foot of the bed. On these socks were bloodstains. The blood on one sock matched Nicole's DNA profile. The blood on the other matched O.J.'s. It suggested the wearer of those socks had walked through Nicole's blood. Hairs consistent with Simpson's were found in a dark blue knit cap at the Bundy scene. Fibers from the carpet in the Ford Bronco were found on that same cap. The sheer volume was staggering. Add to this the timeline established by the limo driver who was to take Simpson to the airport that night, who saw a shadowy figure entering the house just before Simpson claimed to have overslept, and the history of domestic violence, the cut on his finger, and his flight from justice, and the prosecution believed it had a case that was not just strong, but undeniable. However, a mountain, no matter how tall, can be eroded, and the LAPD's collection of this evidence provided the perfect tools for the job. From the very beginning, there were procedural missteps and signs of carelessness that a competent defense team could and would exploit with surgical precision. The crime scene at Bundy was not immediately secured with the rigor one would expect. Multiple officers walked through the scene. Most critically, a blanket from inside Nicole's home was placed over her body, potentially contaminating the scene with foreign hairs and fibers. The lead criminalist, Dennis Fung, and his assistant, Andrea Mazzola, were subjected to a grueling cross-examination where the defense portrayed them as bumbling and incompetent. They were questioned about not changing their gloves frequently, about packaging evidence in plastic bags instead of paper, which could accelerate degradation, and about failing to collect certain bloodstains for weeks, leaving them to degrade in the California sun. But the most damning error concerned a vial of O.J. Simpson's blood. After his initial interview, a sample of his blood was drawn by a nurse. That vial, containing about 8 cubic centimeters of blood, was given to Detective Philip Van Atter, but instead of immediately booking it into evidence at the crime lab, Van Atter carried it with him back to the Bundy crime scene in his pocket for several hours. This single act was a catastrophic blunder. It was the foundation upon which the defense would build its most explosive and damaging theory, that the police didn't just mishandle evidence, they planted it. They had the victim's blood at the crime scene, and now they had a sample of the suspect's blood. The defense would argue that it was not only possible but probable that a corrupt police force used that vial to sprinkle O.J. Simpson's blood at Bundy, on the back gate and inside his own home, to frame him for a crime he didn't commit. What seemed like a mountain of evidence was about to be portrayed as a mountain of lies. Faced with this avalanche of incriminating forensics, O.J. Simpson and his initial lawyer, Robert Shapiro, understood they needed more than a standard criminal defense. They needed a team of legal titans, specialists who could attack every facet of the prosecution's case. And so, the Dream Team was born. It was an unprecedented gathering of legal firepower. Shapiro was the strategist who assembled the team. F. Lee Bailey was the legendary pugnacious cross-examiner. Alan Dershowitz, the famed Harvard law professor, served as an appellate consultant. Peter Neufeld and Barry Scheck were pioneers from the Innocence Project, masters of the still-nascent field of DNA evidence, hired specifically to challenge the prosecution's scientific claims. And then there was Johnnie Cochran, Jr. Cochran's addition to the team changed everything. He was a charismatic and brilliant trial lawyer, known in Los Angeles for winning huge settlements for victims of police brutality. He understood the city's racial dynamics better than anyone. He knew the deep well of mistrust that the black community held for the LAPD, a mistrust that had been validated and amplified by the brutal beating of Rodney King and the riots that followed the office's acquittals in 1992. Cochran saw that this was not just a murder case. It was a case about race, power, and the credibility of law enforcement in a city still smoldering with racial tension. He would become the team's lead attorney, its public face, and its moral compass, transforming the trial from a referendum on O.J. Simpson's guilt into a referendum on the LAPD's integrity. The Dream Team's strategy was a masterclass in creating reasonable doubt. It was a two-pronged assault. The first prong was a meticulous, scientific dismantling of the prosecution's forensic evidence. The second was a powerful, narrative-driven attack on the integrity of the people who collected that evidence. As Barry Scheck famously said, their approach was to challenge the evidence, the collection of the evidence, and the collectors of the evidence. Scheck and Neufeld were the architects of the first prong. They put the LAPD crime lab on trial. Through relentless cross-examination, they exposed sloppy procedures, poor documentation, and the potential for cross-contamination at every step. They turned the esoteric science of DNA into a compelling courtroom drama. They zeroed in on the bloodstain found on the socks in Simpson's bedroom. They argued that the blood contained the preservative EDTA, a chemical found in the purple-topped vials used to collect blood samples, but not in blood from the human body. An FBI lab test on the stains was inconclusive, but the defense spun this ambiguity into gold. They claimed it was proof positive that the blood was not from a crime scene, but had been taken from the reference vial and planted on the sock. They even highlighted how the blood stain seeped through both sides of the sock in an identical pattern, suggesting it was applied when the sock was lying flat, not when it was on a human ankle. The prosecution's own experts were forced to concede that some evidence had been mishandled. The blood sample carried by Detective Van Atter became Exhibit A for the defense's theory of a conspiracy. They questioned why approximately 1.5 cubic centimeters of the 8cc drawn from Simpson was missing from the vial. The nurse who drew it and the criminalist who received it couldn't account for the discrepancy. The defense pounced. 1.5 cc was more than enough blood to sprinkle at Rockingham and Bundy to frame their client. They weren't necessarily proving the evidence was planted. They just had to make it seem possible. And in a case built on forensics, planting the seed of possibility was enough to create a garden of reasonable doubt. The second, and arguably more powerful, prong of the defense strategy was the personal destruction of a single witness, Detective Mark Furman. Furman was the detective who had found the bloody glove at Simpson's Rockingham estate. He was a crucial witness, the one who physically linked the two primary crime scenes. On the stand during direct examination, he appeared to be a model police officer. He was calm, professional, and denied any racial animus. Prosecutor Marcia Clark asked him directly if he had used the N-word in the past 10 years. Furman, under oath, looked at the jury and said, no, it was a lie that would unravel the prosecution's entire case. The defense had been investigating Furman's past and had uncovered a history of racist statements. They found a North Carolina screenwriter named Laura Hart McKinney, who had interviewed Furman for a project about the LAPD. On audio tapes, Furman not only used the N-word more than 40 times, but also bragged about manufacturing evidence, beating suspects, and his deep-seated hatred for African Americans and interracial couples. The discovery of the Furman tapes was the trial's bombshell moment. The defense fought to have them played for the jury, and while Judge Lance Ito only allowed a few short, damning excerpts to be heard, the damage was catastrophic. Johnny Cochran now had his villain. Mark Furman was no longer just a detective. He was the embodiment of a racist, corrupt police department. The discovery of the glove on Simpson's property was recast as the fruit of a poisonous tree. Cochran argued that Furman, driven by racism, had taken the glove from the Bundy crime scene and planted it at Rockingham to frame a famous black man he despised. F. Lee Bailey's brutal cross-examination of Furman, where he was called back to the stand and forced to plead the Fifth Amendment against self-incrimination when asked point-blank, "Did you plant or manufacture any evidence in this case?" was a turning point. The prosecution's key witness was now a perjurer and a confessed racist. Cochran had successfully shifted the focus. The trial was no longer about the murders of Nicole Brown Simpson and Ron Goldman. It was about Mark Furman and the systemic racism of the LAPD. This shift in narrative was amplified by the unprecedented decision to allow a television camera in the courtroom. Judge Lance Ito's ruling turned the trial into the nation's longest-running, most-watched reality show. Every day, the country tuned in. The lawyers, witnesses, and even the judge himself became characters in a national drama. The public scrutinized Marcia Clark's hairstyles and Christopher Darden's courtroom demeanor. They debated the credibility of witnesses like the quirky houseguest Cato Kellen. This constant media exposure magnified every strategic move and every mistake. The prosecution, led by Clark and Darden, found themselves on the defensive, not just in the courtroom, but in the court of public opinion. They were confident in their mountain of evidence, but they seemed unprepared for the narrative warfare waged by the Dream Team. They made several critical errors. They underestimated the power of the racial narrative in a post-Rodney King Los Angeles. They presented a dry, clinical case based on DNA statistics, while the defense told a compelling story of conspiracy and racism. And they made one of the most infamous blunders in legal history. Against the advice of his colleagues, including Marcia Clark, prosecutor Christopher Darden decided to have O.J. Simpson try on the bloody gloves in front of the jury. It was meant to be a gotcha moment, the final, irrefutable proof. But the leather gloves, which had been soaked in blood and then frozen and unfrozen multiple times as evidence, appeared too small for Simpson's large hands as he struggled to pull them on over a pair of latex gloves. It was a disaster for the prosecution. The image of Simpson holding up his hands, the gloves bunched around his knuckles, was seared into the nation's memory. It provided Johnny Cochran with the single most memorable line of the trial, a rhyming couplet that would become the cornerstone of his closing argument. If it doesn't fit, you must acquit. The trial as theater had reached its apex, and the defense had just delivered the show-stopping performance. The closing arguments were a microcosm of the entire trial. Marcia Clark delivered a methodical, impassioned plea, walking the jury back through the mountain of evidence, the blood, the fibers, the DNA, the history of domestic abuse. She begged them to look past the defense's smokescreens and focus on the two people who were no longer there to speak for themselves. Her argument was logical, detailed, and aimed at the jurors' heads. Then came Johnny Cochran. His closing argument was a masterpiece of rhetoric and theatricality, a sermon delivered to the jury and to the nation watching at home. He didn't just argue the facts. He told a story. He invoked the history of racial injustice in America, comparing the LAPD's alleged conspiracy to a cancer. He even compared Mark Fuhrman to Adolf Hitler. He positioned a vote to convict O.J. Simpson as a betrayal of the fight for civil rights. He paced before the jury, his voice rising and falling with righteous indignation. He famously put on a knit cap, similar to the one found at the crime scene, to mock the prosecution's evidence. And he returned again and again to the gloves. If it doesn't fit, you must acquit. It was a simple, powerful, and unforgettable refrain. He was not just speaking to the evidence. He was speaking to the jury's lived experiences, their distrust of the police, and their desire to send a message. He asked them to be the conscience of the community, to stand up to a corrupt system. His argument was aimed directly at their hearts. The jury, composed of 9 black members, 2 white members, and 1 Hispanic member, was sent to deliberate on October 2, 1995. They had sat through nearly a year of testimony, seen hundreds of exhibits, and heard from over 100 witnesses. Legal experts and the public alike expected them to deliberate for days, if not weeks, sifting through the complex scientific evidence. Instead, they returned with a verdict in less than 4 hours. The speed of the deliberation sent a shockwave through the courtroom and the country. It suggested they had not been debating the nuances of RFLP DNA analysis. They had been convinced by the larger narrative. On the morning of October 3, 1995, an estimated 150 million people, more than half the country, stopped what they were doing to watch the verdict. Productivity ground to a halt. The nation held its collective breath. In the courtroom, O.J. Simpson stood, flanked by his lawyers. The court clerk read the verdict. In the matter of the people of the state of California versus Orenthal James Simpson, we the jury, in the above entitled action, find the defendant, Orenthal James Simpson, not guilty of the crime of murder. The camera captured the reaction in stunning, stark contrast. Simpson mouthed thank you to the jury, a look of profound relief on his face. Johnny Cochran beamed, placing a triumphant hand on his client's shoulder. Behind them, Ron Goldman's father, Fred, let out a gut-wrenching sob, his face collapsing in grief, while his daughter Kim wept uncontrollably. The prosecution table was a picture of devastation. Across the country, the reaction was just as divided, and it fell almost perfectly along racial lines. Televisions captured images of black Americans cheering in the streets, celebrating the verdict as a victory against a racist system that had for too long railroaded black men. In the same moment, cameras showed white Americans staring at their screens in stunned disbelief, convinced that a murderer had just been set free by a combination of celebrity, wealth, and a cynical manipulation of racial politics. The trial didn't create this racial chasm in America, but it exposed it with brutal, undeniable clarity. The split-screen reactions became the defining image of the trial's aftermath, a raw and painful portrait of two Americas, living in the same country but experiencing a profoundly different reality. The criminal trial was over, but the legal battles were not. The families of Ron Goldman and Nicole Brown Simpson filed a civil lawsuit against O.J. Simpson for wrongful death. The civil trial was a different beast altogether. It was not televised. The burden of proof was lower, not beyond a reasonable doubt, but a preponderance of the evidence, meaning it was simply more likely than not that he was responsible. And crucially, O.J. Simpson was compelled to testify. His performance on the stand was disastrous. He was evasive, argumentative, and contradicted his previous statements. The jury also saw evidence that had been excluded from the criminal trial, including a chilling photo of Simpson wearing the same type of rare, expensive Bruno Magli shoes that had left bloody prints at the crime scene, shoes he had denied ever owning. In February 1997, the predominantly white civil jury found him liable for the deaths of Nicole and Ron and ordered him to pay their families $33.5 million in damages. For many, this verdict represented a measure of justice the criminal trial had failed to deliver, but Simpson would spend the rest of his life fighting to avoid paying the judgment, his fortune and reputation gone. So we return to our central question. What is the anatomy of this case? How did a trial with such a mountain of evidence result in an acquittal? The answer is that this was never just a murder trial. It was a perfect storm of American obsessions, celebrity, race, sex, money, and violence, all amplified by the 2-hour news cycle and the unblinking eye of a courtroom camera. The prosecution believed the forensic evidence was the story. They had the science, the data, the cold, hard facts. But the defense understood something more profound. They understood that a trial is not a scientific experiment. It is a battle of competing narratives. And in that battle, the most compelling story often wins. The Dream Team told a story of a heroic black man, a symbol of success, being framed by a racist and corrupt police department. It was a powerful and resonant story, particularly in that time and that place. They didn't have to prove it was true. They just had to make it plausible enough to create reasonable doubt. The prosecution, in contrast, failed to tell a coherent story. They got lost in the technical details of DNA and forensics, and they lost control of the narrative. They allowed the defense to make the trial about Mark Fuhrman instead of Nicole Brown and Ron Goldman. The camera in the courtroom was the great accelerant. It transformed a legal proceeding into public entertainment, a daily soap opera that blurred the lines between justice and performance. It taught lawyers that media strategy was as important as legal strategy. It showed the world the deep, painful divisions in how black and white Americans perceive the justice system. The legacy of the Simpson trial is complex and enduring. It damaged public faith in the legal system, introduced the era of the celebrity lawyer, and forever changed the relationship between the media and the courts. But most of all, it was a national trauma from which we have never fully recovered. It forced an uncomfortable conversation about race and justice that continues to this day. The trial of the century was ultimately not about the evidence presented in the courtroom, but about the baggage that every American, from the jurors to the millions watching at home, brought with them. It was a reflection of who we were, and perhaps who we still are. The blood, the gloves, the Bronco, they were all just props in a much larger and more tragic American play. This has been Anatomy of Crime, where the truth is never simple, but always worth seeking.
did I